Welcome everyone to the first in a series of webinars hosted in conjunction with the Sustainable Foods London Conference, which is on the 6th and 7th of November at the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre in London. It gives me great pleasure to really welcome our distinguished panelists today for a very intriguing subject and something that's very on point regarding plant-based alternatives and where the industry is headed in terms of alternative meat. As we know, the sector was booming a few years ago during the COVID times in particular. Sales were going through the roof. A lot of businesses and new industries were popping up within the sector. We had a lot of financial capital flowing into the market, but the past year or so has seen quite a change in mood with investment drying up. A few companies, sadly, not being able to continue in the industry really consolidating. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be discussing the state of the sector, what's been happening, where is it moving to, how is the world viewing alternative proteins and alternative plant-based products in particular. So thank you all for joining us live, again, as part of the Sustainable Foods Conference webinar series. I would ask all the viewers who are watching to please do ask as many questions as possible. We want to have a really vibrant conversation with our panelists, so please do ask questions throughout in the private chat function and we will pass them on to our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome to the team, Frank Galestian, Chris Kong and Al. If each one of you could kick off by maybe introducing yourself. Frank, you were first and properly on time, so why don't you kick us off about your background experience, and then we'll move on to Al and then Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Javad, and hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Frank. I work for Unilever Food Solutions, which is the business-to-business part of Unilever, focused on food service, as a global marketing lead, and I look after the brands of Knorr and The Vegetarian Butcher, so heavily interested in plant-based and in plant-based meat. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Al?
Over to you, Al.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. So I spent most of my career at Planet Organic, which is a retailer in London, certainly at the forefront of health and wellness trends within the UK. So a lot of experience with changing customer requests and changing industry offers over the years. Planet Organic always prided themselves on being first to market, and as leader of the buying team and buying director for my last 4 years, that was certainly very much my role. I left Planet Organic just over a year ago now, and I'm now a partner in a strategy and growth consultancy, helping health and well-being brands, particularly with brand positioning, branding, brand identity, and then strategy and growth plans.
Thank you, Chris. I know you're dialing in from somewhere exotic, so
not super exotic. If a cafe is exotic, I don't know what is. But thank you so much for having me on this panel today, Jawad. I'm Chris. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Better Nature. Better Nature, we're the UK's leading tempeh brand, and the UK's fastest growing tempeh brand as well. For those that don't know, tempeh is an all-natural plant-based protein. They originated in Indonesia about 300 years ago, made using this incredible fermentation process known as tempeh fermentation. And by leveraging this incredible fermentation, we create all-natural, nutritious, and delicious plant-based food products. Recently, for example, we launched into Tesco nationwide, into about 430 stores. We launched into Lidl, every single Lidl store across the UK, so 956 of them a few weeks ago, and sold a unit every 19 seconds through Lidl, which is awesome. So yeah, very keen to engage in this topic of discussion. You can probably tell, I don't think plant-based alternatives are going anywhere. I just think that consumer preferences are shifting, and yeah, I think we're very much leading that vanguard of that consumer shift.
That's a nice lead-in, Chris, to my first question, which keen to hear, Frank, in terms of, the sector has experienced shift in dynamics in terms of sales and how the industry is generally moving forward. What's happened the past couple of years in terms of demand, in terms of the plant-based alternative sector, and where it's headed. So.
Yeah, that's quite a question.
Broad question.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot has happened, and I think it's at a certain moment only logical that you get into this phase where we are in now. But I don't believe all the stories that are out there that we're reaching, the end. I think what we need to understand better and look better is where is the growth for plant-based alternatives, and I think there is a lot of growth. I work in food service, as I said in my introduction, and I speak weekly with a lot of customers, and I think there's a lot of demand. And I think it also depends on the generation of customers and consumers that you're looking at. So it won't be the same across the full population, but there is definitely a lot of demand. So what I think has happened is that this became something super big, and I'm sure that Al and Chris know that much better than I do. And there were a lot of companies trying to get on the bandwagon. But I think what you've also seen, and this is what we learned in some markets, is that there were so many entrants into the market. And that was actually some of the worst competition that we could get because of, failed quality or bad taste references that made people enter the category and immediately leave it again. So I think there was a lot of things happening in the first few years. And now it's more like who has the stamina to survive, who will continue to invest, top quality products, who is available at the right price point, those sort of things.
On that note, I mean, we've had, Beyond Meat announce their sales recently, and there's been a lot of consolidation and changes in the sector. I mean, as you said, there was a lot of interest a few years ago. Al, it'd be good to hear from your experience. What's happened? I know I totally agree with Frank in terms of, the industry is not going anywhere. I think it's it's shifting. So I'd be keen to hear your views on what's happened in the past year or so compared to the initial boom a couple of years ago.
So, I mean, as Frank said, it's big questions. The first thing I would say is that I think we would all agree that we are fundamentally post-peak meat. So we are on an increasing trend of plant-based diets and a decreasing trend of meat-based diets globally. I don't see that reversing in terms of, as a global dynamic, we're all going to turn around and go, that burger tasted a bit funny. I'm going back to eating the same level of meat that I originally was. I think what's happened is we had some very high profile launches within what's actually a really niche sector of the overall food industry. So I do my weekly shopping, and sure, I buy burgers, but a burger is not a cornerstone of my weekly shopping. And what we had in sort of version 1.0, I think, of the meat alternatives was there wasn't enough breadth of product, and there wasn't enough breadth of experience of product to appeal to a particularly broad audience or enough occasions. So if I'm trying to be plant-based, sure, there's a times in my life when I want to eat a dirty burger, but that probably isn't that often. So I think what's more interesting is looking at meals as occasions rather than products, and looking at going forwards, how are we going to transition away from eating meat and what are we going to be eating instead? And the most obvious answer to that is more vegetables. But then it is very much down to occasions and customer profiles and customer groups.
Do you think, Al, that the demand, which has decreased over the past year or so, I mean, what has driven that? Is it just people are watching tightening their belts? Is it that taste is a factor? I mean, as you say, there was a lot of interest, but I mean, the drop has been quite substantial.
So I would say within that sort of alt meat product, which is a specific category within food and is not representative of all plant-based diets by any means, I think version 1.0 of the product wasn't good enough. So I think customers bought into the space because it was new and exciting. It had become very cool. The businesses involved were getting significant investment, much more than is normal within a food business were getting more sort of tech business levels of investment, largely because they were actually tech companies rather than food companies, which also means marketing budgets were phenomenal. So customers were bought on this journey, and then they ate the product and went, meh, that wasn't that great. So then they bought out of the product. I think that has a knock-on effect on availability. So retailers took hits on wastage, so they shrunk range. So then the product became harder to get, or retail prices went up because they were taking a hit on wastage. So this just sort of spiral, but fundamentally, I think for a mass customer group, version 1.0 wasn't good enough. There's probably a few hardcore old school vegans dancing about out there because suddenly their food choices have got that much broader, but in terms of getting the mainstream customer base along, it wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, 1.0 wasn't very good. I know, Chris, you launched, I think, in and around 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and you don't market, better nature tempeh as an alternative. So how is that in terms of sales and where the past few years affected, or maybe even offered a benefit to your product?
Yeah, I guess before I talk a little bit more about better nature and what the last few years have been like for us. I think I want to comment on what Al said about 1.0 meat alternatives 1.0 not being good enough. To a certain extent, I do agree with that. But if you, from a taste perspective, I'd actually say it was pretty excellent. I'd say there are brands out there, for example, Beyond Meat, that have invested tremendous amounts of money in producing what is really great tasting products. If I guess it's entirely subjective, right? But if I can say so myself, I think these are great tasting products. However, I think to what Al said as well earlier, not everyone is, not every person that's looking to adopt more plants into a diet is looking for it in a burger format, right? And is looking for indulgence. I think what the category has done wrong, I mean, it made a lot of sense when the category was growing in the initial stages in terms of acquiring new customers to the category. You need to get people involved and get them, you need to sell them on the dream of the taste, the indulgence of biting into a burger that bleeds, and really sell that novelty. However, after a while, after a year or two, that novelty wears out. And the thing is that like you can't keep on selling that novelty when you already have pretty good consumer or customer penetration with meat alternatives. All these people have already bought into the category. They've already tried these products, but you're not getting them to come back because they're no longer interested. That novelty has waned, right? So where we find ourselves today is that, yeah, exactly as Frank said, there is a great deal of demand, but there isn't demand for, the same old, I guess, processed burgers, nuggets, right? To a certain extent, like, how many of these products does the health conscious consumer consume? And let's not forget that health, or the awareness, or the perception that plant-based diets are healthier is what's fundamentally driving the growth in the plant-based industry, right? It's not necessarily about environmental concerns, right, or sustainability or animal welfare, or at least in the UK that is. In the UK, the number one driver towards adoption of plant-based foods in general is due to health concerns, and the belief that adopting more plants into the diet is healthier, right? So I think that's the trick that meat alternatives 1.0, using Al's terminology, missed, right? All these products were, I think, were over-indexing on the indulgence factor, which worked in the early days to get people into the category, but to get them to stay in, they weren't able to meet the health need, right, that these consumers had. And it's what you absolutely need in order to keep these consumers in the category. So, for us, we launched, as rightly so, as you said, Jawed, in January 2020, and it was a super exciting time for plant-based, in 2020, 2021, I think, especially around meat alternatives. And what we found is that when we first started, right? We tried to position tempeh as a meat alternative. So we created products like barbecue tempeh ribs, right? Trying to emulate as close as we can the usage occasions of meat, but that didn't work, right? I mean, yes, we grew, and in the first year we did all right. We grew 100, about 2x in our second year, but we weren't getting cut through to the customer, and I think it's because we were trying to position tempeh as a product which it isn't. It isn't an alternative. So in January 2022, we completely rebranded and we accepted tempeh for what it was, this all natural plant-based protein. In the same way that you wouldn't call tofu a meat alternative, right? We stopped calling ourselves a meat alternative and we truly embraced tempeh and the fact that it is just this all natural plant-based protein that you can consume similarly to tofu in all sorts of different dishes, right? It's fundamentally an ingredient. And when we made that transition, when we rebranded and adopted this new positioning within the market, we started exploding, right? So we launched into Selfridges in January. Later that year, we launched into Migros, so Switzerland's largest retailer. Earlier this year, we launched into Rewe, Germany's second largest retailer. We then launched into Tesco. We launched into Planet Organic in between as well, which was great. We launched into Tesco, into 430 stores initially, but we're now being rolled out to 570 stores come mid-September. And of course, Lidl. And we've also secured another major retail listing for the end of the year. So I think by adopting this new positioning, we're targeting the same customers, but with different needs, right? They're not looking for indulgence, they're looking for a staple in their diet.
I mean, on that note, I mean, Frank, is it the marketing that is key to shifting maybe consumer habits? Because as Chris mentioned, soya is not viewed as a meat alternative. Tempeh he's not marketing as a meat alternative, but there is that issue where the ones that are marketing themselves as meat alternatives, do they taste good? And are they nutritious? So there are the two issues there. Something is it marketing that can shift attitudes, or is it really the nutritional aspect without putting people off?
I think it is. I think it's both, and I think it depends also a bit on who you're targeting. We've learned a lot from the beginning. Also, we work a lot with Burger King, for instance, and if you look now, there was an article published, I think even yesterday, the top 5 QSRs all have plant-based on their diet, and they're growing the menu. And what they're after is definitely, if you check all the menus, it's animal meat likes in a plant-based version, because that's what their their guests are looking for. And I think marketing is critical there, because what we've learned is that they come there's a lot of footfall there, but if they can't clearly read from the menu that there's a plant-based version, they won't order it. And it's not because they don't like it, it's just because they miss it on the menu. So that's why, for instance, the color green is so important on a lot of menus that you'll see there. And I think marketing plays definitely a role, but it depends on what I said, who you target. If you look at France, for instance, where school menus are sort of mandatory provided and where the government is very influential, I think there's a lot of demand for plant-based that you will see there as well. And that is because now I think 2 out of 5 days, the school lunch needs to be vegetarian, but also plant-based meat is actually a fantastic alternative that brings a lot of diet wishes together, because it's halal, it is vegetarian. So there's a win-win there as well, and you see it picking up there. So I think if you zoom out and look at the different countries, and especially if you also look at the motivations, I think I recognize what's being said, what Chris said about health. But I see a lot of consumers that we're talking to also, like the environmental impact is one of the reasons to switch. So I think the category is broad, and it's in its very early stages. I mean, they're comparing it within an industry that's been around for ages. And we're trying already to define what's the way to grow it. But I think everybody is, to be honest, learning and doing. or learning by.
So I would like to touch on, maybe you could also add to that, Frank. A lot of the health, eating less meat is obviously better for you individually, but also the environmental positive impact that is generated by eating less meat. You can't. It's unbelievable. Now, for me personally, how that needs to be spread into schools, it needs to be spread at a younger age, and there needs to be some form of legislation in terms of pricing of meat, or in terms of in school curriculums of eating a more balanced diet. I mean, can we achieve the goals in terms of supporting reduction and meeting net zero targets without the help from top level, like people like Henry Dimmel, who are advocating eating more plants? Who'd like to tackle that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I mean, it's a topic that yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, it would be phenomenal, right? I'm incredibly biased, right? It's my company, right? It'll be hugely beneficial to Better Nature if there was government legislation around, around, for example, pricing meat at the true cost of meat, right? So Henry Dimbleby in his book, Ravenous, talks about resource, or what's it, like natural capital, right? So the unseen costs of the environmental degradation that not just meat but really any product has in the environment, that's completely missed from just modern day accounting, right? So to be able to introduce that into, I mean, I don't know how, it's you need to rewrite literally all the accounting books in order to do that, but I think legislation that reflects the true cost of meat would be massive. But I think at the same time we can't forget about the people that this affects, right? And the livelihoods that these changes could potentially devastate, right? But I think as a business owner, the way I see it is that I don't have a lot of say when it comes to legislation, or I don't feel like I have a lot of power. But I think what we have is the consumer. What we can do is motivate the consumer to make to make certain decisions, make purchasing decisions. And as we've seen with the milk industry in the US, for example, with some of the largest milk producers in the US going bust during COVID, especially because of shifting consumer trends away from animal-based milk to plant-based milk, right? I think the market forces could potentially, right, just result in the unwinding of the animal agriculture sort of complex, right, industry complex, because these farmers are frankly not making a lot of money. They're not making a lot of profit. And the industry is heavily subsidized by taxpayer money. And it's just a failed business model. And I think if we can prove if we can prove that there's a better, more viable business model out there that's also more environmentally friendly, then we have all the we've got all the winning cards in our pocket.
Al, do you have anything to add on this before I get in some of the questions, because we've already got quite a few on this topic before I move on to the next theme? So do you want anything to add on that?
Well, I suppose the only thing, I'm perhaps slightly cynical on the potential for UK government legislation, particularly that, as Chris has referred to, counteracts their agricultural policy.
Yeah. So
it's going to be consumer trends and consumer awareness, and I see a large correlation with pickup of organic, which has been underwhelming in the UK compared to other European countries in particular, because of lack of government support, particularly within sort of hospital, school catering, that sort of thing. So no, let's not wait for the government to solve the problem.
I would like to pose the first question, which I'd like to add. This is from Laura. Thank you, Laura, for your question. This is, hello, Chris has said number one reason for buying into plant-based is health. With a growing awareness and concern on ultra-processed foods, is that a concern for the plant-based market? Al, do you want to start that off? As you're already not on mute.
Sure. I mean,
I'll put the question on the screen for us as well.
again, we've got a relatively global viewpoint here, and the UK is perhaps not representative of that global viewpoint. So I think there have been other instances and other food trends where the key motivating factor for a UK consumer has been my selfish health rather than my altruistic impact on the planet. The same was always historically true within organic, for instance. So yeah, I think in its broadest sense or its widest sense, I do think that that's probably in the UK that is the main motivating factor. However, I think there's also growing awareness of carbon costs and carbon counting and the environmental impact and cost and those sort of, I suppose, broader hidden costs that Chris was referring to. And I think the younger generation is growing up with much more of an awareness of their carbon cost and their footprint on the planet, and it will become much more of a sustainability consideration within plant-based. But I'm not surprised that at the moment in the UK, the main motivating factor is health.
Yeah, come on in, Chris.
Yeah, again, like, please, everyone take this with a pinch of salt, right? Like, it's very obvious which camp I'm in. But, if we look at, what's happening on retailer shelves, right? There is a growing amount, there is consolidation amongst, I want to make the distinction between meat alternatives and meat free, right? So we talk about meat alternatives. I'm talking about your products. It's my definition. I don't think it's a widely, maybe it's not a widely sort of, adopted definition. But like meat alternatives, I'd say all your products are trying to replicate the look, cook, and taste of meat, right? And meat free, all your products like your tofus, your tempehs, your falafel, which are just plant-based protein that are really their own thing. It's entirely they sort of sit in their own subcategories. And if we look at retailer shelves, there's evidently a lot of consolidation within the meat alternative space, and it's not necessarily because these businesses are going bust, though that is unfortunately something that is happening. It's because that retailers are starting to perceive, right, that consumers are shifting their behavior away from meat alternatives towards meat free. So we look at the champions within the category. 2-3 years ago, it was your likes of, Meatless Farm, for example, right? Obviously, very sadly, that they've been acquired now. But now, if you look at where are which are the brands that are growing most quickly within, say, the alternative protein category more broadly, it's your likes of Bowl, right? So Bowl, they do all natural plant-based, like ready-to-go meals and shakes. They're growing incredibly well. Tofu Company, they're doing incredibly well as well. So I think, sorry about the background noise, but yeah, I think there's shifting consumer trends, and whether that belies the fact that consumers are becoming more aware of the ultra-processed nature of meat alternatives, I'll leave it to the audience to decide that for themselves. But yeah, I think retailers are also behind that movement.
Yeah, sorry about that. Frank, I mean, if we go back to the question itself, I mean, in terms of the ultra-processed nature of some of these products, I mean, is this not a concern? And especially as there's more dialogue moving in towards this conversation.
No, and I think it's ultra-processed. I think in general, if you look at plant-based meat, or probably also meat-free alternatives, I think there's a lot of myth busting that we need to do, because likewise, there's also discussion on soy, for instance. So I think I think it all has to do with education and sharing transparently how the products are being made, what's in it, what the health benefits are, but also what's not true. There's a lot of fake news around processed food. There's also a lot of let's not forget the meat industry also is quite powerful and has been a yearly event. If you think, for instance, only about the whole debate about whether or not you could name a plant-based steak a steak. those kind of things. So I think there's a lot
Yeah.
of myth busting that we need to do in education, and that takes time because it's a relatively new category, and over time that will sort itself out. I'm convinced about that. But currently the debate about processed food could be something completely different if we meet again in a year, and then the category is only 1 year older.
I'd like to ask a question now by Colin. Thank you, Colin, for your question, which is, what key strategy does the panel believe will drive the widespread adoption of alternative meat products in the mainstream market? So, Frank, what strategy is going to drive the adoption of alternative meat products?
So
meat-free products, as Chris has mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm only looking at food services. So I'm not talking about retail.
Yeah.
But what I'll definitely see is that since COVID, the sort of restaurants that have grown rapidly are the quick service restaurants across all markets. It's a global trend. There's not one single market where this is not the case. If you then zoom in on what the top dishes are or the most popular menu items, they're all working towards a plant-based version of that. McDonald's has with Beyond Meat a product. Burger King has the Whopper with the vegetarian butcher. So I think this is going to drive. Everybody's looking currently at what's happening in the QSR space, and that will translate itself. It will take ages before it's becoming mainstream. But if you look now, for instance, again, Burger King in Germany, 1 out of the 5 Whoppers that they're selling is a plant-based version from the vegetarian butcher.
Yeah.
And that if this continues with the growth, the amount of restaurants that they're opening, and if you see the amount of products, the menu penetration increasing, then I think this is what will drive for food service, at least the development towards more mainstream.
Al, do you have anything you want to touch before I move on to the next stage of the sector?
Well, I suppose, what would I add? I think within retail, what I see as what's happening within sort of the multiples retail in the UK is actually that buyers are starting to rely on their historical relationships and historical brands to provide them with extended range of plant-based. So whether that's Richmond, whether that's Linda McCartney, most supermarket buyers, no disrespect to them, but they don't have a huge amount of bandwidth to invest in sort of the fringes in their category. So it will be mostly driven by those historical big brands and those historical key relationships. And over time, I think that sort of opens up opportunities for smaller players. But I also think, going back to Chris's comment around meat-free, you could call it plant-forward, not my terminology, that actually giving the health-conscious consumer simple to prepare, but actually sort of ingredients rather than finished dishes. And you know, the opportunity are in the things that fill the occasion of but do not replicate, I believe. Yes.
Quickly, Chris, before we get into the next generation approach.
I mean, I'll basically like stole the words out of my mouth, but I want to add that I think cost is also an incredibly important strategy, right? And I think that's so I just want to put it out there.
Cost is on the agenda in this in the next 15 minutes, I hope. But I would like to ask in terms of what's next in terms of plant-based alternative products. I mean, what's the next generation of protein that's potentially going to take the industry forward, or in a different direction, or can make a lot of these products nutritious and tasty? So, Frank, over to you.
I think there's a lot of work that we're doing on protein diversification. Whether it's pea, algae, I mean, there's a lot. I think this brings cost immediately into the discussion now, because there's already a lot possible, also available, but at a much higher cost than soy. Well, we know the category already has, in some markets, an issue with pricing. So I think we need to diversify our protein base as an industry, but we also need to find a way to make these products then cost competitive. And I see that as the bigger challenge than diversification, because that's simply a technology. I think the cost is the
Yeah.
most important one to tackle.
I mean, we're getting a lot of questions about cost. So should we just jump into cost? I mean, until, alternatives meat-free products are cost competitive, is this conversation still in its infancy? Al?
I think it depends on where you're talking. So to go back to Frank's comments about quick service restaurants, the cost is competitive, I imagine. If I'm going to buy a plant-based Whopper rather than a Whopper, well, I would expect to pay the same amount. In retail, it is different. And I think there's probably three sides to that, which is the scale of manufacturer, retailers' margins, expectations, and costs of wastage. So scale solves everything. But I'm also not sure if the direction of travel is, well, I was going to buy this pack of burgers, but I'm now going to buy this pack of burgers as a direct replacement. So that sort of swap for the meat to the alt meat, based on all of the conversations we've already had within retail, I'm not sure if that's where the future's going. I also, if it becomes more about how do I cook more with plants simply and quickly for my family, that's a different conversation than what am I going to buy instead of this pack of sausages and what's the cost. I also think we need to try and, if we can, move the conversation on from protein. Because actually,
in what sense?
Well, we're talking about protein and alt protein. None of us need as much protein as we think we need. We all historically have probably eaten too much meat, and now we're potentially going to eat too much meat alternatives. So should we be more focused on decent sources of fiber, for instance, within a plant-based diet? Because if I am eating a broad variety of plants, my protein needs are met. I don't need to worry about what's the protein on my plate. So let's talk about how do I cook more with beans, or what can you do with beans? And there are interesting players, I think, in the plant-based space who actually don't do anything that even looks or tastes remotely like meat, but are still providing that sort of bulk to a meal, let's say, to their customers.
Chris, you seem to be itching to get in.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to tell the audience that Al and I, we don't have a deal with each other. We have crossed paths in the past. I think on the topic of costs, I think there's also there's a misconception that plant-based foods are more expensive, right, than meat. I think in some instances, not all, but in some instances, meat-free options can in fact be far cheaper, right? I mean, if you look traditionally, maybe looking at just like your beans, your legumes, of course, that's way cheaper than meat. However, even products like tempeh, if I can plug, we are cheaper than sort of free-range organic chicken breast, or organic tempeh is significantly cheaper than organic chicken breast, right? For example, obviously way cheaper than beef. Right, and I think there is a misconception that just because I'm going to the meat-free aisle, I'm buying these meat-free products, suddenly I'm going to have to pay a premium. I think that's a bit of a there's some debunking there within the consumer perception that needs to be done. But exactly as Al said, I think retailers aren't making it that much easier for us, right? If we need to sort of put a 40% markup on our products, then it makes it more difficult.
Where does the cost of living conversation come into this? I mean, I'll jump on to what Chris said, but where does that come into it?
I thought you were going to move away from cost. The only thing that I was going to say, also add to cost, is that we're not in a level playing field.
Yeah, exactly.
So meat and dairy are heavily subsidized industry.
I agree.
So the retail price that you're paying in a shop is nonsense, actually, in terms of the cost of production of the product.
Yeah.
So do we have any aspiration that a non-heavily subsidized industry is going to compete?
Frank?
No, that was actually the point I was trying to make as well. And I saw it somewhere in the comments, somebody posted it as well. Because if you would see what the true price of animal meat is, then I'm sure that we've already reached the tipping point and that probably plant-based meat is cheaper or alternatives are cheaper than animal-based. meat.
Yeah. We've got 5 or so minutes left. I'd like to move to a couple more questions. One from Charlie in terms of, I'll put that on the question on the screen for everyone. What are the latest innovative developments regarding product development for meat alternatives? Has this innovation reached its peak? The latest I'm aware of was bleeding alternative products, but texture still seems a major barrier to purchase. Chris, why not?
Yeah. And in fact, it was something I wanted to add, earlier. But I think there are incredible developments happening at the moment, especially in the field of precision fermentation and solid state fermentation, right? So, if we look at precision fermentation, for example, these are technologies that have been applied in the biotech space for decades, right? The production of insulin no longer requires us to harvest pancreases from pigs. We've got a massive vat that produces human insulin, right, for us. Production of enzymes to use in our dishwashing tablets. Very similar principle. Instead of producing insulin or these enzymes, we produce milk proteins, casein, whey, or even meat proteins, right? You've got Impossible Foods that's been implementing this technology and producing hemoglobin to make their products taste more like meat, right? By literally using the same compounds that make meat taste like meat. But if we were to take that one step further, it's exactly solving for that texture component, which comes from, I think, solid state fermentation. So it is a very wide field, but essentially leveraging, for example, mycelium in most instances, so the underground sort of networks of mushrooms to really derive the texture that can cook and taste like meat without any artificial ingredients. I think that is where we'll see the biggest innovation. If we can, the texture, I'd say, is actually really great with plant-based meat alternatives today. But it's about how do we create that texture without the use of ingredients that consumers may feel a little bit worried about. For example, binders and gelling agents and massive ingredient lists.
Frank, Al, would you like to add to that question?
Yeah,
in terms of latest innovative developments?
Yeah, I think the category became famous because of those that bleeding capability. Yeah. I think that was how it was all introduced. I think what you see next now is a lot on mimic. So I think I agree with Chris. I think texture at the moment is great. There are a couple of products, also when we do blind tasting, where people don't tell the difference between animal and plant-based meat when it comes also to texture. I think what you'll see more is the muscled kind of plant-based meat alternatives. So I would say that that's the next big thing you'll see hitting the shelves in retail, but definitely also in food service.
Al?
Well, I suppose I have an answer which is based on what I hope rather than what I think. I think I see a lot of work around how do I mimic a shrimp? How do I make a plant-based shrimp that tastes like a shrimp? I'm sort of much more interested in how do I make it really appealing and attractive to eat more plants. Yeah. So what can we do with whole food ingredients to make them into something that is quick and simple and delicious and cost effective for the customer based on whole foods ingredients? There's a product out there I really like, which is made from shiitake stems. So it's mushroom stems that sort of naturally have a texture which is similar to something that is chewy and meaty. So what can we do with that, or with beans, or with whatever else to make delicious food, rather than this sort of trying to come up with an alternative? Because my concern for the alt products is, if that becomes the mainstream, then where are we then? Do we look forward to a weird world where I'm eating a fake shrimp, never having eaten a real shrimp, at which point I'm going, why am I eating this weird, curly, slightly chewy thing?
Well, I mean, we are at the end of our discussion. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Frank, Al, and Chris. As I mentioned at the start of the broadcast, this is part of the Sustainable Food Conference on the 6th and 7th of November, where I hope all our speakers here today will be joining us live in London. So please do, everyone, join us in November. A warm virtual round of applause for everyone who's kindly taken their time off today to speak to us. And we hope to see you soon in our next webinar in a few weeks' time. But thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.